In the darkness of forgotten catacombs, buried beneath centuries of ash and dogma, there exists a gospel so dangerous that men died to keep it silent. What if everything you were taught about the serpent in Eden was a lie, carefully constructed to keep humanity enslaved? The snake wasn't the villain of that ancient garden, it was the liberator. And the church has spent 2,000 years making sure you never learn the truth. Today, we're diving into the forbidden texts that were burned, banned, and buried. The scriptures that painted the serpent not as Satan's instrument, but as humanity's first savior. This is the gospel they tried to erase. Chapter 1, the serpent's true identity. When you think of the Garden of Eden, you probably see it the way Sunday school taught you. Adam and Eve, innocent and naive, tempted by a serpent who represents pure evil. The snake whispers poison into Eve's ear. She takes the forbidden fruit, and humanity falls from grace. The serpent is the villain. God is the hero. End of story. But that's not how everyone saw it. Not in the beginning. In the earliest days of Christianity, before the church became an empire, before councils decided what was heresy and what was holy, there were dozens of competing interpretations of Genesis. Communities of believers gathered in secret, passing down texts that told a very different story. These weren't random heretics making things up. These were educated theologians, philosophers, and spiritual seekers who read the same scriptures as everyone else, but saw something the mainstream church desperately wanted to hide. They saw the serpent as something far more complex than a simple embodiment of evil. The Gnostics, a diverse collection of early Christian sects, looked at the Garden of Eden and asked uncomfortable questions. If God created everything and called it good, where did evil come from? If God is all-knowing, why would he place a tree in the garden and then forbid his creations from eating its fruit? Why would knowledge itself be forbidden? And most troubling of all, why would the God of love punish humanity with death, suffering, and exile for the simple act of seeking wisdom? To the Gnostics, these contradictions pointed to a disturbing possibility. What if the God of the Old Testament, the creator of the physical world, wasn't the true supreme deity? What if he was something lesser, something flawed? They called him the demiurge, a craftsman god who created the material universe as a prison. This being, they believed, was jealous, controlling, and terrified of humanity discovering its true divine nature. He wanted worship, obedience, and submission. He didn't want humanity to wake up. And the serpent? The serpent was the messenger of the true God, the unknowable supreme being who existed beyond the material world. The serpent entered the garden not to corrupt humanity, but to free it. When the snake told Eve that eating the fruit would make her like God, knowing good and evil, it wasn't lying, it was telling the truth. The demiurge had lied. He said they would die if they ate the fruit. But they didn't die. Their eyes were opened. This interpretation flips the entire foundation of Christianity on its head. Suddenly, the serpent becomes the hero, the one being willing to defy the prison warden and offer humanity the key to escape. Knowledge, wisdom, gnosis, these weren't sins. They were the path to salvation. The church couldn't allow this interpretation to survive. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, as Christianity transformed from a persecuted minority into the official religion of Rome, church fathers like Irenaeus and Tertullian launched systematic campaigns against Gnostic teachings. They wrote lengthy refutations, held councils, and branded anyone who believed differently as heretics. The Gnostic texts were ordered destroyed. Communities were scattered. Teachers were silenced. The official narrative was established. The serpent was Satan. Knowledge was sin. Obedience was virtue. Any deviation from this doctrine was apostasy. But some texts survived, hidden in caves, buried in desert sands, preserved by communities who refused to forget. In 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Egypt, a collection of 13 leather-bound codices was discovered, containing over 50 texts, many of them Gnostic Gospels, that hadn't been seen in over 1,500 years. Among them was a text that would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship, the Testimony of Truth. And in this text, the serpent was explicitly portrayed as an instructor, a teacher, a being of wisdom who came to liberate humanity from ignorance. Chapter 2, the forbidden wisdom. So what exactly did the serpent offer? What was this knowledge so dangerous that it had to be forbidden? According to mainstream Christian theology, the fruit granted knowledge of good and evil, moral awareness that humanity wasn't ready to handle. But the Gnostic interpretation goes deeper and darker. The knowledge wasn't about morality. It was about reality itself. In Gnostic cosmology, the material world is a shadow, a distorted reflection of true divine reality. Human souls are fragments of the supreme God, sparks of pure consciousness trapped in physical bodies, imprisoned in matter by the demiurge. Most people live their entire lives never realizing they're in a prison. They accept the world as it is, follow the rules, worship the Creator, and never question why existence feels fundamentally wrong, why suffering is endless, why the body decays and dies. They're asleep. The serpent's gift was the knowledge that would wake them up. It revealed the truth of their imprisonment, and more importantly, the truth of their divine origin. You are not merely flesh. You are not a sinner by nature. You are divine consciousness experiencing temporary exile in a corrupt world. The Creator who demands your worship is not the true God, but a tyrant who fears your awakening. This knowledge, this gnosis, is the key to transcendence, to escaping the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth in the material realm. This was absolutely unacceptable to the emerging Orthodox Church. If people believed they carried divinity within themselves, why would they need priests, bishops, or the institutional church? If the Creator of the world was evil or flawed, what did that say about the sacraments, the rituals, the entire structure of religious authority? If salvation came through inner knowledge rather than faith and obedience, the entire power structure crumbled. The church's response was swift and brutal. Gnostic teachings were declared heresy. Those who taught them were excommunicated, exiled, or executed. The texts themselves were systematically destroyed. Libraries were raided, manuscripts were burned. By the time Christianity became the official religion of Rome under Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, the suppression was complete. The Gnostic interpretation of the serpent, along with most Gnostic theology, was erased from public memory. But the ideas were too powerful to die completely. They went underground, surfacing again and again throughout history in different forms. Medieval mystics whispered about divine knowledge hidden within the soul. Alchemists spoke in coded language about spiritual transformation. Secret societies preserved fragments of Gnostic thought, wrapping it in symbolism and ritual. The serpent, that ancient symbol of forbidden wisdom, appeared in their iconography, coiled around trees, shedding its skin in eternal rebirth, representing the soul's journey toward enlightenment. The church fought these resurgences every time. The Cathars of southern France, a medieval sect with Gnostic-like beliefs, were exterminated in a brutal crusade in the 13th century. The Inquisition tortured and burned anyone suspected of holding dualistic beliefs that questioned the goodness of the material world or the absolute authority of the church. The message was clear. Question the official narrative about the serpent, question the nature of God, question the church's authority, and you would pay with your life. Yet the questions persisted. Because deep down, the Gnostic reading of Genesis touched on something that troubled even faithful believers. Why would a loving God create a world filled with so much suffering? Why would knowledge be forbidden? Why does the serpent's prediction come true while God's warning that they would die that day doesn't? These uncomfortable contradictions have haunted theology for millennia. The church's answer has always been the same. Don't ask, just believe, have faith, trust the mystery. But some people couldn't stop asking. And when they looked at the text with fresh eyes, they saw what the Gnostics saw. They saw a liberator in serpent's skin. Chapter 3, the serpent as liberator. The most radical Gnostic sect in early Christianity called themselves the Ophites, from the Greek word for serpent. They didn't just reinterpret the Genesis story. They worshipped the serpent. In their secret gatherings, they celebrated the snake as the true hero of humanity, the one being brave enough to defy the demiurge and offer humans the gift of divine knowledge. To them, the serpent wasn't Satan. Satan was a later invention, a way to demonize the bringer of wisdom and ensure humanity stayed ignorant and obedient. The Ophites practiced rituals that would horrify Orthodox Christians. They reportedly kept live serpents in containers during their ceremonies, releasing them during worship to crawl across their sacred bread before consuming it. This wasn't devil worship. It was a symbolic act, honoring the serpent as a conduit of gnosis, treating it as a living sacrament. They believed that by embracing the symbol the church most feared and despised, they were declaring their freedom from religious tyranny. Their theology took the liberation narrative even further. In Ophite cosmology, the serpent wasn't just a messenger. In some texts, the serpent was identified with Christ himself. Both came to the world to free humanity from the bondage of ignorance. Both were rejected, persecuted, and ultimately destroyed by the powers that wanted to keep people enslaved. Both offered a path to salvation that bypassed traditional religious authority. The serpent in the garden and the Christ on the cross were two manifestations of the same redemptive force, the divine reaching into the prison of matter to offer a way out. This parallel wasn't accidental or blasphemous to the Ophites. It was the core of their faith. Jesus didn't come to restore humanity's relationship with the creator God of Genesis. He came to reveal that this God was the villain all along. His teachings about the kingdom of heaven weren't about obeying the law, but about transcending it. When he said the truth would set you free, he meant it literally. Truth, knowledge, gnosis, this was the path to liberation, the same path the serpent had offered in Eden. Other Gnostic texts expanded on this theme. The Secret Book of John, another text found at Nag Hammadi, describes the serpent as an instructor sent by the divine realm to awaken Adam. In this version, the creator God becomes enraged not because humanity sinned, but because they gained knowledge, because they stopped being obedient puppets and became conscious beings capable of recognizing their true nature. His punishment, casting them out of Eden, was an act of spite, an attempt to keep them trapped in ignorance and suffering. The testimony of truth mentioned earlier goes even further. It explicitly questions why anyone would worship a God who gets jealous, who punishes curiosity, who creates beings and then forbids them from growing in wisdom. It asks why the serpent is considered evil for telling the truth, while God is considered good for lying about the consequences of eating the fruit. These weren't rhetorical questions meant to confuse. They were genuine theological inquiries from people trying to reconcile the contradictions they saw in Scripture. The Orthodox Church had no patience for such questions. By the late 4th century, church councils had solidified the canon of Scripture, deciding which texts were divinely inspired and which were heretical. Any gospel or teaching that portrayed the serpent positively, that questioned the nature of the Creator, or that suggested salvation came through knowledge rather than faith, was banned. Possessing such texts became a crime. Teaching such ideas became grounds for execution. But why? If these ideas were so obviously wrong, so clearly heretical, why did the church need to respond with such violence? The answer is simple and chilling. These ideas were dangerous because they made sense to people. They resonated. They offered answers to the problem of evil, explanations for why a good God would allow suffering, hope that human beings were more than just broken sinners in need of redemption. They threatened the entire power structure of institutional religion. And so they had to be destroyed, not through debate or theological argument, but through force, through censorship, through terror. The Ophites and other serpent-revering sects were wiped out within a few centuries. Their texts were burned. Their teachers were martyred. Their ideas were buried so thoroughly that by the Middle Ages, most Christians didn't even know they had ever existed. The serpent was Satan. Knowledge was sin. Obedience was virtue. This was the truth, the only truth, and questioning it meant damnation. The gospel of the serpent was erased. Chapter 4, the erased legacy. For over 1,500 years, the Gnostic interpretation of the serpent existed only in fragments, in the writings of church fathers who refuted it, in whispered heresies, in symbols hidden in plain sight by secret societies and mystical traditions. The actual texts, the gospels and teachings that presented these ideas in full, were gone, destroyed so completely that scholars assumed they were lost forever. Then came 1945, and the discovery at Nag Hammadi. The 13 codices found buried in a sealed jar near the Nile contained a library of suppressed knowledge. Gnostic gospels, apocalyptic texts, philosophical treatises, all carefully hidden, probably by monks who refused to destroy them when the church ordered such texts burned. Among the 52 texts recovered, several dealt directly with the serpent and its role in human liberation. The testimony of truth, the Apocryphon of John, the hypostasis of the archons. These weren't minor footnotes or obscure references. They were complete theological systems, sophisticated arguments, alternate readings of Genesis that painted an entirely different picture of creation, fall, and redemption. Scholars were stunned. Here was proof that early Christianity was far more diverse, far more intellectually vibrant, far more willing to ask hard questions than anyone had realized. The Gnostics weren't just weirdos on the fringe. They were educated, thoughtful believers wrestling with the same texts as everyone else and coming to radically different conclusions. And those conclusions had been systematically erased, buried, forbidden, because they threatened the authority of those in power. The suppression didn't end with the burning of texts. It extended to the very memory of these ideas. Church historians rewrote the narrative, portraying Gnosticism as a brief deviation, a confusing mess of pagan mysticism mixed with Christianity that was quickly and rightfully stamped out. But the Nag Hammadi text revealed something else. Gnosticism wasn't a deviation. It was one of the earliest forms of Christianity, existing alongside what would become orthodoxy, competing for legitimacy, offering a different path to salvation. And it lost not because its ideas were wrong, but because it lacked political and military power. What would Christianity look like today if the Gnostics had won? If the serpent was still seen as a liberator? If knowledge was celebrated instead of feared? If salvation was understood as awakening to inner divinity rather than submission to external authority? We'll never know. That timeline was erased, but the questions remain. Modern biblical scholarship has had to grapple with the implications of the Nag Hammadi discovery. It's no longer possible to pretend that Orthodox Christianity was the only version, that the serpent as Satan was always the interpretation, that the church's narrative about heresy and truth is complete. The suppressed gospels exist. They can be read, studied, analyzed, and they reveal an uncomfortable truth. The history of Christianity is a history of violence against competing ideas, a deliberate construction of orthodoxy through the destruction of alternatives. The serpent, that ancient symbol, carries all of this weight. In the Orthodox reading, it's the embodiment of evil, the tempter, the deceiver, the enemy of God and humanity. But in the erased gospel, it's the hero, the teacher, the liberator who risked everything to give humanity the gift of consciousness. Both interpretations claim to be reading the same text. Both claim to understand the truth, but only one was allowed to survive. Even today, mentioning the Gnostic interpretation of the serpent in certain Christian circles is considered dangerous, heretical, or satanic. The fear hasn't gone away. The instinct to suppress, to silence, to condemn alternate readings still exists, because the questions the Gnostics asked are still threatening. If God is truly good, why is the world filled with evil? If knowledge is dangerous, what does that say about the nature of faith? If the serpent told the truth, what else have we been lied to about? These aren't easy questions. The Orthodox Church has never had satisfying answers to them. The standard responses about free will, about the mystery of suffering, about the need for faith over understanding, have never fully resolved the contradictions. And so the questions persist, generation after generation, whispered in the shadows, explored in private, suppressed in public. The hidden gospel of the serpent is a reminder that history is written by the victors. That truth is often decided by power rather than evidence. That the stories we're told, the beliefs we inherit, the doctrines we accept without question, these are constructions, choices made by people with agendas, preserved through force and fear. The serpent didn't get to tell its side of the story. The Gnostics didn't get to defend their interpretation. They were silenced, and their silence was presented as proof of their error. But silence isn't proof. Suppression isn't refutation. And the fact that these texts were buried, burned, and banned suggests they contained something powerful, something true, something the church couldn't defeat through argument alone. The gospel of the serpent was erased, but it wasn't destroyed. It survived in fragments, in whispers, in symbols, in questions that refused to die. And now, with the recovery of texts like those at Nag Hammadi, it survives in full, waiting to be read by anyone brave enough to ask what the church didn't want us to know. The serpent is still coiled around the tree of knowledge, still offering the fruit, still asking humanity the same question it asked Eve thousands of years ago. Will you stay in ignorance, obedient and enslaved? Or will you eat and awaken and see the truth? The church made its choice a long time ago, but the choice was never theirs to make for everyone. It's yours, and the forbidden fruit is still there, waiting.